Okay, awesome. Well, so before I get started, I want to thank Liat and Nikhil for inviting me and for organizing this workshop. It's been really great, so let's give them a round of applause. I'd also like to thank you for still being here. I know as great as it's been, I'm pretty tired at this point, and so I'll do my best to kind of reward you for sticking it out until the bitter end. So I'm going to be talking about affordable housing. And I think affordable housing is something that probably many of us don't necessarily have firsthand experience with. So I thought I'd get started by talking a little bit about what are the different types of affordable housing. So one thing that we often hear about is public housing. So public housing, there's over 1 million families living in public housing in the United States today. It's federally funded. So HUD, the Department for Housing and Urban Development, is the one that's actually providing the funds, but they're giving it to all of these local housing authorities who actually administer and run the public housing units in their city or town. Now, a lot of you may be surprised to hear that public housing is still a big deal in the United States. That's because we're really not building any more of it, but we're maintaining a lot from that was built decades ago. So most of, for example, the units in New York are over 30 years old. Now, another federal program is Section 8. You may have heard of Section 8 vouchers. So this is actually the biggest component of HUD's budget and provides housing for 2.4 million families. And I'm not going to talk about it today. I have another paper on it. I'd be happy to talk to you about Section 8, but that's not going to be the point today. But there's another type of affordable housing which is increasingly, I guess, trendy. Which is what people call inclusionary zoning. And so the idea here is that we want to create diverse neighborhoods with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds all living in the same place. And we want to do that without the government spending money directly. And so the way to do that is to have the government offer incentives to developers. For example, normally there's this zoning restriction that you can't build more than 10 stories. But if you offer 20% of the units you build at below market rate, we'll let you build 14 stories. So there are things like this. There are different ways of doing it. So some cities will actually mandate that you have to have a certain percentage below market rate or pay a fine. Other cities will give you some sort of tax break. But the basic idea is that it's a public-private partnership where the developers are building housing units that are then going to be offered at below market rates. Yeah.
What stops the developers from offering these below market rates to their friends and relatives?
Right. So the city also has policies and procedures that the developers need to follow when filling these units. So usually the way it works is the developers are in charge of the process, but there's city oversight to make sure that they're following certain protocols. So this is increasingly popular. It's all done locally. So different cities will have their own rules about how it's done. And so today I'm going to be focusing on kind of these two types of housing. So how is it actually being allocated today? Well, pretty much every public housing authority is using some sort of wait list. And the rules for the wait lists do vary. I'm going to take some questions or some answers from an FAQ for Providence. So in Providence, you get on a wait list. Can I choose where I live? No. What happens if I refuse your offer? You go to the back of the line. Right? So I like this because it's very simple and straightforward. It's also fairly representative of what most housing authorities in the United States are doing. Right? So some of them will say, well, if I refuse the first apartment, you're OK. But once you refuse the second offer, then you go to the back of the line. You know, and there's variants thereof. But this is like a pretty representative system. Okay. Now, inclusionary zoning and the new units we're building are generally allocated very differently. So here's the system in New York. They pretty much all use lotteries of some form. Here's what, so in New York, there were almost 8,000 units built last year. All over, I would say all over the city. It's not literally everywhere. Like I don't think there were any built in Staten Island, but at least covering many of the boroughs. And so this is what it looks like if you actually log on. So I mentioned that there's protocols and procedures. If you want to qualify for these benefits as a developer, you need to list the unit on the city's Housing Connect portal. And so here's a list of different developments and the application deadline if you're interested in applying for the lottery for that development. And so in order to apply, you create a profile. This takes only a few minutes. I went and did it. And then you click this apply button next to each of the developments that you're interested in applying for. And they have separate lotteries for each development. Now, it might not surprise you to find out that these lotteries are very oversubscribed. Right? So every time it's a slow news day, some newspaper will decide to run an article with inflammatory headlines and big numbers. So this is something that there is clearly a lot of demand for, at least at the prices at which it's being provided. And a natural question is, how should we be doing this? Right? So in particular, why are we using waitlists for all of our public housing and lotteries for all of the inclusionary zoning? Is there some reason that the kind of optimal system would be different in these two cases? And can we say which of these systems is actually better? And second of all, of course, there's no reason to think that either of these is like an optimal system, so we can start thinking about what other alternatives exist that might be able to improve upon them. Yeah, Yuri.
So in the zoning, it's not clear that those are cheap houses, right? So you just told us you have to sell them below market rate.
Good. So basically the government will set numbers. You have to have rents that are, say, in this band. And often it'll actually offer a menu of options to the developers. So like in New York, you can choose to target very low income people, but then you only need to take, say, 15% of your units. Or you could, say, target moderately low income people, but then it has to be 20% of the units you built. But it's not just any number that's below market rate. It's kind of like a specific schedule set by the government based on percentages of the median income. Okay, so this is the question I wanted to ask, is we know how we're doing it, but how should we be doing it? And before we can answer that question, we need to know, what are our goals here? What are we trying to achieve with these policies? And it's actually surprisingly difficult to kind of pin that down in a precise way. But I will tell you the goals that I have in mind, and I'll also show you how they get kind of incorporated into my model. So in particular, one thing I was able to find was this document from the UK that talks about its objectives explicitly. And these are two that I picked out. Support for those who have great need, and greater choice for people who are applying. And I think these two are certainly quite widespread as goals. They're far from the only goals, but they're going to be the goals that I'm focusing on today in the talk. And so to have a model that allows us to actually discuss these issues, we need a few features. So first of all, we need agents that are different in their level of need. And I'm going to capture that as an outside option. Right? So some people just have a better outside option than others. And the people with the greatest needs are the ones with the worst outside options in my model. Second, people are going to have different preferences. They're going to care where they go, and they're not going to all agree on which place is the best. And then third, maybe least surprisingly to people in this audience, I'm going to treat this information as private information, and I'm going to assume the agents are acting strategically in whatever mechanism we set up. Okay, any questions on the background of housing and how it works? Next slide, I'm going to jump into a model. Okay, we've either got people who are pretty tired or who are really eager to see a model. I'm going to assume the latter. I appreciate that interpretation. Okay, so the model is in discrete time. So in every period, we're going to have some new things arriving to the market. Some of these things are people. Some of them are a new development. I'm going to have a continuum model. So we have a continuum of agents, a unit mass of new people arriving. And the new development, sadly, can't house all of them. Right? So it can house some mass mu less than 1. Okay, so in each period, we're going to take the new people that have arrived and add them to any previous people that are waiting from earlier periods. They arrived earlier but haven't been matched yet. And we're going to have some sort of matching mechanism where we assign them to today's development. This mechanism is going to ask them for some information and use that to determine a matching. So a very simple mechanism would be, I could ask you, are you interested in applying for today's house? And you say yes or no, and then I have a lottery among everyone who said yes. Right? So, but we're going to allow a very general class of matching mechanisms. So some of these people are going to be matched to today's development. The rest of them are going to move on. And there's one minor inconvenience here, which is that if we have more people arriving than leaving in every period, the system is just going to spiral out of control. And while that may be a reasonable description of what's actually happening, it's not actually very convenient mathematically. So we're also going to assume that some unmatched agents leave exogenously with some probability 1 minus, or yeah, they exit with probability 1 minus delta.
Does that depend on their outside option and utility, or is that just sort of random?
No, good question. So delta is actually fixed and the same for everyone. Yeah. Okay, so that's the way it's going to work. People arrive, they get matched, and then most of them continue on, but some of them leave. And we have to talk about utilities. So you asked about outside options. So every agent has an outside option. And the way to interpret this outside option is, in each period where I'm not matched, I get a utility payoff equal to my outside option. On the other hand, if I match to a particular building, I have some value for that building. And I'm going to get a utility payoff equal to that value for every period that I stay in the building. So this is how I'm capturing these two features. Agents differ in their level of need. And they also have different values because I'm going to assume that these values are drawn IID across agents and time. Turns out the really important one is that they're IID across time.
Sorry?
Yeah.
So they stay forever, or there is an end time for the system? Or
Great. So I'm going to have this same exit probability even once you've been matched.
I see.
Yeah.
But when you're matched, you stay matched until you leave. Huh?
Perfect. Yeah. So I'm going to, following the way they actually do things, once you've been assigned to an apartment, in general, you're not eligible to apply in the system or to move. So there's increasingly some conversation in cities about, maybe we could improve outcomes by letting people move, after they've initially been assigned. But the state of affairs currently is there are families living in a lot of these places where maybe when they got it, they needed a 3-bedroom apartment because they had lots of kids. All their kids are out of the house, but they still have a 3-bedroom apartment that's just really underutilized. So at least for now, moving is not very common, and it's not a feature of the model at all. So once you're matched, that's where you're going to be.
So period J is just apartment J, right? Like the apartment.
Yeah. Yeah. So periods and apartments are in 1-to-1 correspondence because we have one new apartment in each period. Okay. And so now we might hope that this system equilibrates, and we want to look for some sort of stationary equilibrium. Now I haven't specified the action set yet because that's going to depend on which mechanism we're looking at. But the intuition or how we model it is, if we fix everyone else's actions, then for me as an individual agent, I'm essentially just facing a Markov decision process. I'm going to have some decisions to make, like do I enter today's lottery or not? And then I'm going to stochastically get matched or not. And I'm trying to solve my MDP optimally.
Sorry.
Yep.
I missed how the apartments evolve over time. So every period you said there's a one new apartment?
Exactly.
If you don't match that apartment, does it get stored for next period?
So we're going to match each apartment as soon as it comes online.
Even if no one wants it?
Yeah, so it turns out when you take the combination of assumptions we have, so in particular the IID nature of preferences and the fact that we have enough, like more agents than there are spaces, and the continuum model, so that the law of large numbers applies, you're always going to have enough people that want it. Yeah.
So just to make sure I'm understanding is, the heterogeneity in the values comes from the periods, not the subplot, right? You don't have basically. I mean, you assume the subplot in each period is the same to every, but different in different periods.
No, that's not correct. So the V is indexed by both I and J, where I is the agent and J is the time period. So I might like today's development, and you might not for the same development. So you can think of this as being like neighborhoods. I like a unit that's close to where I already live or where I have friends or family, and if you work in a different part of the city, it's not nearly so appealing to you.
Why is it IID?
So the answer is because it's mathematically convenient. I think the next follow-up question is, okay, which of the results depend on the IID nature? And I'll be happy to say more on that once I've said the results, so feel free to ask that question again. Yeah. I basically think of it as the simplest model that can get started answering these two questions of, are we matching the right people, and are we matching them to the right places?
So IID across agents and periods.
That's right. That's right. So the fact that it's identically distributed across agents isn't going to be so important, but independence across agents is important. Okay, so let's take one of the systems we've talked about that they're actually using in practice, and let's embed it into this model. Let's choose kind of the matching mechanism. So in particular, let's take the Providence waitlist. I've entered the system as an individual agent. I've waited around for who knows how long. And eventually, I get an offer. And now I have a decision to make. Should I accept this offer or not? Now, if the place is worse than my outside option, it's easy, right? I just reject it. But otherwise, this is not such an easy decision, because it depends on what I think about how long it'll be until I next receive an offer, as well as how good that offer will be. Right? And so I'm going to make some conjecture, I'm going to have to wait tau periods before my next offer. And in terms of how good it will be, it's drawn IID from this distribution, which I know. And I know my own outside option. And so I can kind of combine all of this information to make some decision, which is going to be an acceptance threshold. If I'm going to accept it as long as it's good enough.
The delta is like discounting.
Yeah, in essence, it's it serves the role of a discount factor, as well as actually causing you to exit the system.
I mean, shouldn't delta be set endogenously? It depends. If you don't accept an offer, there are some other people who might accept the offer.
So that doesn't affect delta. Think of delta as being how likely I am to stay in the system. So with some probability, my mom gets sick, and I decide to move back to my home state and leave New York, and then I would have left my housing no matter what. But I think what you're getting at, maybe, and tell me if this is not what you're getting at. So a lot of this is exogenous. What's not exogenous is this number tau. How long I have to wait until the next offer.
If you receive an offer, you're assuming that it will remain valid, so that units will remain vacant with probability delta every period, right?
No. So think about it as, if I say no to the offer, they're going to go to the next person on the list and fill it. Now, because we're in a continuum model, my decision isn't really going to have an impact on how far down the list we go. But essentially, yeah, no, all the units will be filled. So if I say no, someone else is going to take it behind me. But certainly, among all of these quantities here, most of them are exogenous model primitives, except this tau. Right? The amount of time I have to wait is going to depend on other people's behavior. Right? So in particular, because of this feature that we're talking about, where we're going to go as far down the list as we need to fill the unit, if a lot of the people ahead of me are turning down offers, then I'm going to advance through the wait list very quickly, and tau will be smaller. So I need to form some sort of rational expectations about this tau. And of course, tau can't just be anything. Right? So in particular, it's not going to be feasible for the developer to say, I'm going to make you an offer every period. Because if they did that, then too many people would accept, and they would end up matching more than the supply they have. So it has to be the case that tau actually clears the market, given the supply that we have.
Is tau the rate, or is it deterministic? You say every tau period.
So in a waitlist, it's going to be deterministic or nearly so. Right? So every 10 periods, you come to the top. Now, because of integrality issues, it could be that it'll be sometimes 10, sometimes 11. And that's just because we're working in a discrete time model instead of a continuous time model. But you should think of it as being essentially every deterministic number of periods, I reach the top of the list again. Okay, so this is what the decision process looks like for an agent in this wait list. Wait around, get an offer, I have an acceptance threshold, and I have to decide, is it worth taking this or waiting another tau periods for another draw? Okay, how about the independent lotteries that they're using in New York? So the decision you face here is slightly different, but similar. Right? So now I see a development today. I know how much I like it. I have to decide, is it worth entering the lottery?
Is there a cost to entering the lottery?
There's no cost to entering the lottery.
Is there an obligation to accept the house if you enter it?
Great. So, so in practice, no. And so given that, I think the obvious thing you'll say is, why not just enter every lottery? Great. So now, of course, if you win a lottery, you actually have to show up for an interview. You have to give over your papers. So there is a cost to that. So it's actually not going to matter for the purposes of our model whether we think of it as agents only apply if they would accept, or agents apply everywhere, but then when given the offer, only some of them actually follow through and accept. That's actually going to be a key feature. So if you want, you can think of it as every agent just says, why not go down that list of units that I see, click apply every time, and then when I get selected for some of them, I'll make the call then. And so in that case, the analogy of this would be, I've just been notified that I've won this lottery. Should I take the building, or should I wait to find out the results of future lotteries? Okay, and so to answer that question, you're really comparing how does matching today to this unit compare to my continuation value from staying in and playing more lotteries down the line. And so again, you have to think about the same things, right? How much do I like this unit? How much would I like future stuff? And in particular, how likely am I to win the future lotteries? Right? So if I believe that I'm very likely to win future lotteries, of course I'm going to set a high acceptance threshold today. Whereas if I think that the probability of winning future lotteries is almost 0, then I'm going to accept almost anything today. And so again, based on this information, I'm going to choose some acceptance threshold. And again, P is this endogenous quantity that needs to clear the market. And so this is the formulation of these two, is basically we're looking for some sort of consistent P and some sort of consistent tau. And the first result, which I would say it surprised me when I was first thinking about this, but hopefully may not surprise you as much given how I presented this, is that actually these two systems turn out to be equivalent. What do I mean by equivalent? Well, I mean, for every agent, there's an identical probability of matching, an identical distribution of how much you actually like the place you've matched to, conditioned on matching. And if you're also worried about, well, how long do they have to wait in the system, the expected time in system is also the same for every agent.
And the joint distribution of these three things is also identical?
So for each agent, the probability of match, distribution of what you match to, and expected time in system are the same.
So in the waitlist, stochastic nature comes from this exit probability?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons it's a stochastic problem from the perspective of the agent. One is the exit probability, that I'm not sure if I'm still going to be around the next time I get an offer. The other is my value. So I know my value for today's unit, but I don't know, when I get offered something in 2 years, I don't know how much I'm going to like it.
So basic question, you're assuming delta less than mu, or it has to be it, otherwise it will spiral.
No, so it would be a stable system for any delta. In general, delta is going to be greater than mu, technically. But
You're matching only mu fraction, right? Unit mass arrives, you're matching mu fraction. So 1 minus mu fraction remains unmatched, right?
Yeah, but everyone in system exits with probability delta. So eventually, once the system got big enough, it would equilibrate. So the number of people waiting will depend on delta. If delta is very large, meaning that I stick around for many periods, then the number of people competing in any given lottery will also be very large, because I'll be competing with people who arrived 5 years ago and are still trying to win a house. But for any delta, it's going to be stable. Any delta strictly less than 1.
So me applying to do 2 different units, one I like more than the other, but there's still another person before me? No, the other way. So I renege to one of the houses, and then the next person is going to accept the one. Ah, shit, hold on.
I'm ready.
So there's 2 different units.
Yep.
I am first in one, I get this offer, okay? But I'm second in this other one. If I renege, the second one, the one that's next to me, is going to say yes to his, is going to leave free the house I really want.
Right. Okay. So I'm gonna head you. So in the model, these lotteries are done sequentially. So I don't know the outcome of tomorrow's lottery when I'm deciding whether to accept or reject today. And in practice, that's also a reasonable approximation. Although we could go into detail. I mean, even though they're all listed at the same time, they all are run kind of sequentially.
Loosely speaking, does the theorem hold for reasons similar to revenue equivalence?
I would say, so that we are going to use some envelope theorem type stuff for later results in the paper. This is actually kind of beyond what you could get from a sort of revenue equivalence theorem. Because it turns out for this result to hold, it will continue to hold if I allow a lot of agent heterogeneity. So as long as we could have different value distributions, we could have different costs of waiting, and I could add all of these features to the model and it would still continue to hold. So the real thing that's kind of driving it is this question that Nikhil asked, which is we could think of the lottery as instead of first I apply and I've committed to accepting if chosen, we could instead imagine first they have the lottery among everyone, and then among the winners of the lottery, they're asked to accept or reject. And once you view the lottery this way, these 2 systems start to sound very similar, right? In both, I'm an agent. I come in. I wait around, waiting for an offer. At some point, I hope to get an offer. If I do, I can either accept it or I can reject it, in which case I'm kind of back in the original state that I was when I entered. Right? And so the only difference is, with lotteries, each period I'm flipping a coin with probability p to decide who gets offered. So the time until my next offer is geometrically distributed. Whereas with a waitlist, it's basically deterministic, right? Like every 3 years I get another offer. Okay, so there's I started with the question of which of these 2 systems is better, and at least within the model, the answer is they're equivalent.
Does this still hold if you have correlated value distributions among the agents?
So great question. You mean like there's a unit that everyone agrees is, or most people agree is better than, yeah. So my informal answer is yes. I'm actually working on Peng and I are working on a follow-up paper that makes that point, but it requires a somewhat different model. So within this model, I can't answer that question, but actually, yes, it turns out that this equivalence will continue to hold. Okay, so both of these systems are equivalent. I'm going to argue that they're also both bad. So what do I mean by that? So here's a map of New York. We have Alice and Bob. Alice lives and works in the Bronx. Bob lives and works in Brooklyn. They're both looking for a break on their rent. We happen to have units in both areas. And they're both posted, so they apply in both of these lotteries. Now, we happen to resolve the lottery for Brooklyn first, and Alice is selected as a winner. And she doesn't know the outcome of this lottery here, so she's going to accept it. Meanwhile, this lottery actually selects Bob as a winner, and he's going to accept it. Right? And so we'd like to swap, but it just so happens that those aren't the lotteries that we won. Right? And you can do the same, obviously the same idea for the waitlist. Right? We had this unit first. Alice was at the top of the waitlist when this unit became free. We offered it to her. She said yes. Bob was right behind her. The next unit we offered to him, he also said yes because neither of them wanted to wait for years to get another offer. So this seems pretty bad. So the goal would be, can we do better? And with a bunch of matching people in the room, I'm sure you can come up with some ideas. So let's hear some thoughts about how we might be able to resolve this inefficiency. Yeah.
If you look at the Myerson option of revenue optimal, it says that if you a priori know that some people have low purchasing power compared to your other buyers, then inflating their bid actually helps your revenue. So it looks like it's the government gave a certificate that these people have lower purchasing power. So if a fully market mechanism is that you inflate their valuation for the housing, and then you find the market clearing prices. So you actually are increasing the revenue for the builders. You are finding more economical housing for these people. And the government's role is basically to distribute this inflation, like maybe give a virtual dollars. This is the
Okay, good. So I'm hearing a couple of different thoughts here. So one, you're thinking about how can we maybe favor the people with worse outside options, and
it's actually in the builder's interest to favor those people, because that way
I'm not sure.
That's what the Myerson auction is. It gives.
So the builder is getting a fixed revenue from these units, and I'm not sure that they would agree that it's in their interest to attract the people with the worst outside options. But
You say through a subsidy.
Through a subsidy, I'm not saying that the Myerson auction doesn't charge a higher price. So it just say that, let's say if you are half as rich as Bill Gates, Myerson auction will just double your bid, but you still have to pay.
But then the
right. So at the very least, you could imagine trying to bias the rules of the system in favor of certain people. Now that doesn't directly address this issue. That's kind of more getting at the equity issue of are we targeting the right people. But something else that you said, which was, can we use some sort of pseudo market with virtual currency, certainly seems like a reasonable thing to do, at least if you're a theorist like I am, right? So virtual currency is one possible system we could think about using. What else?
No top trading cycle thing happening here somehow.
Okay, so you could say, well, maybe this is like an initial allocation, but can we let them trade? Yeah, so I'm not going to explicitly model that, although I will actually prove some upper bounds against benchmarks that include that. In practice, I think there are some challenges to that because of the dynamic nature of the problem, that if Alice gets assigned, maybe it will be several more months until Bob moves here, and maybe by that point there's a lot of friction in moving Alice back out of the apartment that she just moved into. But I think there's value to considering it and to trying to facilitate that. Like currently not allowed, but we could imagine trying to allow it.
So what happens in the UK is you get a window once you get to the top of the priority list. I mean, the tower, unfortunately, is not finite. Once you are at the top, you are only at the top once in your life. And so you get I think you get a maximum of 3 offers depending on the council. And you're allowed to, you have about 3 months basically to find your place. So I guess it's an idea of market thickening basically to try and avoid the most egregious forms of this happening.
Okay.
But maybe that's not as far as you want to go. So it will still leave an option for this, but at least you're trying to.
Great. So we could take that to the extreme, right? And say, well, why kick you out after 3 months or after 3 offers? Let's just let you keep your spot in line.
Why they don't do that, because we suggested it to them and they said part of the issue is that what they don't want, it's very difficult to schedule these appointments to, as you said, you have to go and fill out paperwork and see the apartments. The scheduling of actually getting people to view the apartments is very hard.
Right.
So they ration how many offers you have to be able to keep them.
Yeah, so I've had conversations with housing authorities in the United States asking them the same question, and they've given me the same answer. Which is nice, at least. We have some sort of consistency across oceans. That basically, it's a lot more work for them to process lots of rejections, and it causes delays in the allocation of the housing. Now, I think there are ways to surmount both of those. Like, I think those are not fundamental concerns with this. So in the model, we're going to assume that these rejections are costless and just allow you to turn down offers. Yeah.
So could you just allow Alice to essentially give Bob that housing and then just get his place in the waiting list or something like that? Essentially, let her trade the position in the wait list, a better position.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the question here, and I think there's value to considering that, although it would be relatively more difficult to implement because of the dynamic nature, right? So Alice has already moved into her place, and 2 months later, Bob gets, a good lottery draw for this place in the Bronx.
What I'm saying is the moment Alice is matched to that place, she never goes there. She essentially takes Bob's place in the waiting list, and Bob goes directly there. She gives up that place and offers it to someone in the waiting list who wants it, and instead gets that person's position in the...
I see. So if we're doing a waitlist system, you could say...
Higher probability. So essentially she trades her current offer for a... No, she doesn't go at the end.
Right. So she obviously doesn't move up because no one ahead of her wanted it. But she might not move down that much. Yeah. So you could consider that. And I would say like this idea that Alex was proposing was kind of one extreme, which is that you assume that the next person who wants it is basically right behind you, and so you don't lose any ground.
Right, whereas this would depend on how valuable or otherwise this is. If it's, nobody likes it, then you're essentially going to back the line. So.
Right.
So we are talking about trades in an economy with a continuum of agents, and they have IID. So you have a continuum of IID variables. I'm not sure whether in this setting how...
No, I don't have a continuum of IID values because I have one value, as an individual agent, I have one value per period. So my maximum value I'll ever see in my lifetime is
a continuum of agents at each period, right?
Correct.
And those agents have IID values.
Yeah, so there's someone who really likes this place. I agree.
But just for that period, not me.
Right, yeah, there's someone who really likes this period's place.
So within each period we can do trades. Or is this what you were talking about when we...
So within each period there's no point in trading because everyone's either allocated or not allocated.
Yeah, but then across periods, I'm just saying it's hard to define trades when you have continuums of agents with IID preferences.
So you're saying...
What is the ordering? In a discrete word you can define it, but in a...
I'm gonna hold off on delving into those definitions for now. But what I want to highlight are some of the ideas that have been raised here, as well as some others. So one, you could let people keep their spot after rejecting an offer, right? And this is, in fact, exactly what they do in Amsterdam. So in Amsterdam, you can keep your spot as long as you want. You could say, well, the problem is really that people are applying even for stuff they don't really want. It's maybe just marginally better than their outside option. Let's prevent them from doing that by limiting the number of places they can apply. Singapore does something kind of like that. If you are someone who is experienced in like the tie-breaking literature in school choice, you might say, well, this is kind of like doing multiple lotteries, like independent tie-breaking, and maybe something like random serial dictatorship or a common tiebreaker would be better. And then, of course, you might also think, let's just give everyone virtual money and let the market clear that way.
It seems your problem arrives at each period almost, because once you are, your value is changing over time. So, it's not only at the time you are assigned, but next period you may have this.
So once I'm assigned, so my value for a given building is constant in time. So once I'm assigned, I know my value for this place that I've moved into, and that's not going to change.
Forever.
Yeah.
Are you going to answer no?
Sorry?
To answer no to this question?
Oh no, we can do a lot better. We can do a lot better. Okay. Yeah, no, we can definitely do a lot better. So I'm going to start with one thing that I think would be better, which is this common lottery idea. So let's talk very briefly about how we would implement this. So in practice, what I'm imagining is when you join the system, you get a lottery number. Now, we still have all of those listings like we had before. You can still click apply for whichever ones you're interested in. And we're still going to go through the list in order of lottery number. It's just that the lottery number is now linked to your identity rather than drawn anew for each building. And so if you happen to apply for a building where your lottery number is better than everyone else's, you're definitely going to get it. So that's the proposal.
This is like the KVV ranking.
Yeah, in essence. Yeah, I would say it maps to that in a way, which is that all of the buildings have a common ranking over applicants, over agents. Yep. And so in the model, this also becomes a very simple thing to analyze, because actually in the model with all preferences IID, buildings are going to have the same cutoff for kind of how good your lottery number needs to be to get in. And so what that really means is that at the beginning of your lifetime, you enter in the system, we give you a number. It's either good enough to get matched or it's not. If it's good enough to get matched, it's actually good enough to get matched anywhere. And so you can choose whichever building you want. And you're just solving an optimal stopping problem of like, when should I accept it?
That's only because you're in a continuum, no? If you were in discrete, the thresholds would be changing.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I were in a large discrete model, the thresholds wouldn't be changing that much. If I were in a large discrete model with additional kind of correlation and preferences, then we have a whole different conversation to have. But yeah, in this model, in the continuum model, it's very simple, which is just that I either have a good lottery number and can choose a lot of things, or I don't have a good lottery number and I can't choose anything. And I think that feature would still hold true, right? That for many agents, the ones at the very top would get to choose pretty much whatever they wanted. The ones at the bottom would get to choose nothing. And then in reality, there would be people in the middle who kind of face more uncertainty or variation. Okay, so given this, it might not surprise you to hear that, okay, the people that win this lottery are going to have an incentive to be picky, right? Because I know I can get any development I want. I'm going to wait until one I actually like. And so sure enough, it gives higher value per match for every agent. So if I fix an agent and I say they got matched, how much do they like their place? The answer is going to be a lot more than they did before. Okay. Now, we can also compare it to some of the other systems we had on the previous slide. It actually turns out in this baseline model that I've told you, these are all equivalent. So in particular, for those of you that want an artificial currency and are worried about the skeptics who say we could never implement that, if you believe this model, it would say, well, one way to implement that is just to have a common lottery. Now, it turns out this finding is not fully robust even within the model. So I haven't presented it in this version, but we do have weighting costs in our model. And once you add weighting costs, we no longer have that all of these are equivalent. So in particular, I'd rather be told right away that I have my choice of everything versus like in a wait list, I have to wait for years, and then once I finally get to the top, I have my choice of everything. And so once you add weighting costs, what we actually could say is the common lottery has higher value per match than any of these other systems.
Sorry, what is single entry lottery?
So single entry lottery is apply to whatever you want, but you can only apply to one thing, and if you lose, I'm kicking you out of the system.
In the artificial currency case, are you assuming everybody gets assigned the same amount of currency?
I am, yeah. Yep.
But you could incorporate, you could give people who would waited longer, kind of.
Actually, so I'm allowing that. So if you want, you can give people currency in each period, and the currency can be a function of how long you've waited. It just can't be, I can't distinguish you ex ante. So like two people that have waited the same amount of time, or who have behaved in exactly the same way, I have to give the same amount of currency to. But I would actually allow that case. So yeah, so theorem 1, without participation costs, these are all equivalent. Theorem 2, with participation costs, the common lottery actually does the best according to this measure of value per match. And then, of course, these are just specific other systems. You can actually show that asymptotically, if people are patient, if they're sticking around in the system for a long time, the common lottery is the best you can do according to this measure. So this seems great. We love the common lottery, but there's one more thing I want to talk about, which is we haven't actually talked about who's matching, right? So I said at the beginning, we want to match the right people to the right places. The previous slide is saying this common lottery does a really good job of matching people to the right places, right? Because the lucky winners can choose whatever they want. They're going to choose something that's really good for them. The concern is it might not be matching the right people, right? So in particular, we're choosing the winners completely randomly. So even people with very little need have a decent chance, have the same chances of being selected as a winner as anyone else. So that seems potentially concerning. Now, the status quo may not actually be any better. Right? So if we think about the status quo, if we imagine that everyone's applying for every lottery in New York, which is maybe a slight exaggeration, but not too far from the truth, it's possible that that actually also leads to a random allocation of who's getting matched. But under some conditions, well, one condition, which we call there are a lot of agents who don't really need this too badly, then in that case, we can actually show not only that independent lotteries are doing a better job of targeting, but actually this is a fundamental result that is proved using the envelope theorem about any two allocation mechanisms. As it says, under this condition, if I have two systems and one of them is better at matching, the other one's better at targeting.
So in the previous slide, the third theorem, the common lotteries asymptotically optimal, in what class among these?
No, among a huge class that includes like some, I don't want to go into it, but basically among everything, yeah. That can't see your outside option, right? So as long as we take the outside options as private information, among anything there. But by this theorem, it also tells you that if this condition is met, it's doing the worst targeting that you could do. So that kind of leaves us stuck. What should we do? And I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm happy to continue this conversation afterwards. But our answer is basically, I think they should still do something like a common lottery or a waitlist where they let you keep your spot. There's a few different reasons I could give to justify this. One is, under some conditions, this is utilitarian optimal. So basically, any additional targeting benefit you get from changing to another system is much less than the losses from matching people to the wrong places. Now, you can construct examples of distributions for which it is actually important the most important thing is finding the right people and matching them. But if that's really what we need to do, then I would argue in practice we have better ways of doing it than taking away choice and hoping that will result in good sorting. Right? So in particular, one thing that all of these systems do is they have income-based eligibility criteria or income-based priorities. And so if you imagine that income is correlated with your outside option, by favoring people with lower incomes, I could also target to those with worse outside options. And then among those people with low incomes, I should just let them actually choose where they were going to live. Yeah?
Why can't you just give higher probabilities if you can measure need? You just let them draw from a somewhat skewed utility.
Exactly. So that's exactly what I'm saying. In the model, we can't measure need. Right? So in all of our results of when you can't measure need, in reality, I think we can. And therefore, in reality, I think that doing something like independent lotteries is a really stupid way of targeting to the right people. We should just use our measures of need, target to them explicitly, and then let them choose. So that's what I've got. I think it's kind of baffling that we're using these systems that A, are equivalent in our model, but B, are, I think, pretty bad. Don't really give people choice. And why do Amsterdam and Singapore have better systems? And I think the answer is really the law of large numbers, right? So in Amsterdam, over 40% of the units in the entire city are social housing. In Singapore, over 80% of units are publicly built. So you've got a big constituency of people that are going to be pissed off if you're using stupid systems like this. Whereas in the United States, there's no one really to advocate for change. And I'm hoping that some of us can actually become those people. And so I've been having conversations with the housing authorities in New York and in Minnesota. And they're ongoing, and it's slow. And I'm crossing my fingers and hoping something works. So thanks a lot.
Has a burning question.
So is there like an outside market for these? Like, do people like swap on their own?
It's not allowed.
Okay.
So if a government inspector comes by and finds someone whose name is not on the household application living in the apartment, you can lose the apartment.
All right, so hopefully Nick can stick around in case people want
Happy to.
questions. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.